Hello, and welcome back to the Murakami Companion podcast, a show inspired by the works of Haruki Murakami, where we analyze his body of work in its entirety. Today we'll be talking about First Person Singular, a collection of short stories released in Japanese in 2020 and in English in 2021. From the get-go, spoilers ahead. If you haven't read this book, stop this podcast, go buy the book, read it, and come back here. Because it's one of those where it's an experience. This book is something new. And when it hits you, the big spoiler, the big plot twist, the truth about this book, it's a pretty cool feeling. And when the second truth hits you, it's yet another experience. So, again, spoilers, you have been double warned. So let's dive into the story, into the experience of the book. Because with each short story collection, there's been some sort of theme or a mood. For example, Men Without Women. It's about short stories about men without women. The Elephant Vanishes are all short stories that are kinda wrong and off-putting somehow. It's kind of a dark book. After the Quake, it's about stories related to a certain real-life earthquake. And Blind Willow, Sleeping Woman are all stories that are more poetic and ethereal. So at first glance, you might think that First Person Singular are all stories not only narrated in first person singular, but also stories that are somehow defined by that choice. Which is kinda true, I guess. But then you realize, because the clues are carefully placed, so you can figure it out at the right moment, you realize that the stories are interconnected and in chronological order. So the narrator is the same guy in every story, but in different stages of his life. Then the first big reveal happens. The main character is Haruki Murakami himself, telling us about some strange adventures he had through his life. So you think, oh my god, we're finally getting an autobiography. And then you start putting it together even more, and you realize that some of these anecdotes are the inspiration for some of his books, and that's mind-blowing. And then much later there comes the final twist, which drops on you when you realize that the stories start to get weirder and more magical and more bizarre. And in the very last stories, it's just impossible stuff. It's still a character called Haruki Murakami, but he's meeting talking animals and traveling through dimensions. And it hits you that this whole journey has been entirely fake. Or if some of it has been real, you can't be sure of it. You just can't. In writing classes, I learned about something very important called the emotional truth of the story. Even if these stories doesn't have any actual factual truth to them, they are emotionally true. When he tells the story about falling in love at first sight with a girl who had a Beatles record with her, that story might not be true, maybe it is, but you can sense he's describing something he once felt. The feelings are real. When he's talking to an animal, that conversation is very probably fake. Animals just don't talk, at least most of them. But I kind of feel that in the real world, he actually had a similar conversation with someone. This book feels, in some ways, more real than the actual autobiography, which you can say it is the book Novelist as a Vocation. Having said that, the book is still wonderful. There's a story about love at first sight. There's a story about finding a jazz record that supposedly didn't exist, losing it, and then having a musician play it for him in a dream. There's a few stories that are a little bit darker, but nothing scary. It's a solid compilation of short stories, and it's a solid follow-up to Men Without Women. As a final footnote, even if this book was released in 2020 in Japan, it wasn't written in 2020, because, publishing doesn't work that fast. This is definitely not a book written in the pandemic, but those who read it when it came out, we might have some memories attached to it from that time. So it's either like a book that comforted us during a hard time, or it's a book that we read in a time of stress and sorrow. Those are not very good lenses to judge a book with. So people are probably very biased in one way or another when they criticize the book or when they review the book. So I say, judge it for yourself. And if you read it during lockdown, maybe give it another go. You can get first person singular pretty much anywhere where good books are sold. If you want to support this podcast or you just like t-shirts, coffee mugs or art prints, we got a few digital stores where you can find all of that and more, featuring the cover artwork for this episode, inspired by first person singular. There will be one design for each episode release of this podcast.